Hello, and welcome to our Summer Reading Tales and Tales buddy making video series from the Public Library of Brookline. My name is Robin, and I'm a teen librarian at the Brookline Village Library. I'm here today to show you how to do some basic sewing and different kinds of stitches. The Buddy Making Challenge is a part of this year's summer reading program at the Public Library of Brookline. If you haven't already, you can register for our summer reading program at brklib.com/beanstack. For this video, I'm going to show you how to do some basic sewing techniques and how to do a few simple stitches that you can use when sewing your buddy and when attaching things to your buddy. So first you want to look at your embroidery floss. Embroidery floss is used obviously for embroidery but can still be used for sewing as well. And when you first get your floss, when you unwind it, cut a length that you find manageable to sew with. You're also going to get two different kinds of needles. You'll get a tapestry needle, which has a big eye, and that helps you use thicker strands of embroidery floss. The embroidery needle is there if you need it. It has a sharper tip and a smaller eye, so it's a little trickier to use. Now with your embroidery floss, it has 6 strands in 1 strand of floss. And then if you look at it, you can see that there are ways to unravel it. And for most of the stitches that I'm doing in our demos, I'm using 3 strands of embroidery floss. If you ever want to make a very thick line of stitches, then you can use all 6. And many you can use 2, just depends on how it looks to you and what you think works best. It can be a little tricky to unwind the thread, so just be patient and keep pulling on the part of the thread that isn't unraveled and pull it out straight so that you can keep dividing up the strands that you need. Now you'll want to tie a knot at the bottom of the thread. You may need to tie 2 or 3 knots on top of each other just to make sure that it doesn't come through, especially the sock has a slightly open weave to the sock, so you don't want anything to come popping through and have your stitches unravel. I did mine about 4 times, just for good measure. And then you want to thread the floss through your needle. You may need to dampen the end of the thread or snip off some stray threads to give you a very flat edge to thread through the needle. But with the big eye, it's pretty easy to thread the floss through. The first stitch I'm going to show you is a running stitch, and it's partly a running stitch because it simply goes down the fabric. It's a very simple one. You come up through the back of the fabric and then you go down a distance of 1 stitch and go through to the back and pull it all the way through, and then you just go the same distance up and come up through the fabric from the back and then go back down. And you just want to keep the stitches even. And this kind of stitch is good for either decoration or for attaching 2 pieces of fabric together. It isn't super secure, so things can come through the stitches depending on how small or large your stitches are. But it's a very basic stitch, and it will certainly do the job if you're just trying to sew 2 pieces together, or if you want to make a decorative stitch onto your buddy. Now, one thing that may be tricky to do is how to finish your thread on the back side of whatever you're sewing. So you can go through one of the stitches that you've already made, and that just helps you kind of go through and make sure that it's attached to something on the back. And then if you go through and keep the thread and make a loop and then tie a knot with the thread that you've got through that back stitch, then you can just pull it tight and you'll basically have tied a knot around the stitch on the back, and then you can snip off the tail end. So the next stitch is a simple stitch, but it's a little more secure than the running stitch. It's called a back stitch. So you start the same way as you did with the running stitch, and you start at the beginning point, go back down through the fabric, and then you want to go a distance ahead to a 1 stitch length up into the fabric and then come through the back again. But instead of going forward like you did with the running stitch, you go back and you put your needle through the hole at the end of the stitch that you made before. And you pull that all the way through, and then the next time you come up through the fabric, you do the same thing. You go forward, what's basically the distance of 2 stitches, and then go back to the stitch before. And this just makes for a more secure seam. It's less likely to come apart in any way, and it'll make sure that none of your stuffing comes out, for example. And then another stitch I'm going to show you that's a little bit more like a straight line is the stem stitch. The stem stitch is used in embroidery to do the stems on flowers, which is where the name comes from. But you do the same stitch that we did the back stitch, and then come up through the back of the fabric right next to that final stitch. And then you're going to weave your thread through all of the stitches that you've already made by going from, in this case, right to left or down to up, and twist the embroidery floss around the stitches you've already made. And as you can see, it makes it more of a solid line if you really want to make a line in terms of the embroidery on your buddy. This can make a really nice line pattern. And it's a little bit of a twist, so there's a little bit of texture, but mainly it makes a solid line. One thing to make sure of when you're doing the stitch is to make sure to not pick up parts of the fabric, so just go underneath the stitch and make sure not to pick up the fabric that's underneath. And then here you can see an example of me using the stem stitch on an actual buddy that we created. So this one is going all the way through the stuffing and everything. So you can see I make that first stitch, and then I come up a stitch down through the back of the fabric, and then do the back stitch. So I go back 1 and forward 2, and I'm just making a little smile here, so it's a little bit curved. And then you just keep going. You can sew right into the stuffing and through the fabric this way. This is one of the nice things about sewing when you've already got your buddy stuffed, is you don't have to worry about what the back will look like. And then you want to go all the way through, 2 stitches ahead, and then back through. And in this case, I feel like I've got a pretty good smile. It's just a subtle smile, but it's there. So then I come back up right next to the stitch I just finished. And then I'm going to turn my buddy and go through the stitches on the top from right to left. And again, you have to make sure not to catch the fabric as you do this, just to get a nice solid line. And then you can see what it looks like once you make the solid line onto the buddy. One good thing about the buddy when you've already got it stuffed is you can pull the thread all the way through the buddy, through the stuffing, all the way out the back, and then it should be pretty secure inside there, so you can just snip off the back and then you've got a thread inside, but you won't be able to see it. Now the final stitch I'm going to show you is a ladder stitch. A ladder stitch is a great way to do a seam stitch. So if you want to close off the bottom of your buddy, for example, and it's invisible. So once you do it, the stitches will be pretty hard to see. In this case, I'm using a bright blue thread, so you'll see them a little bit, but you should all have floss that is more matching the sock that you have. So it shouldn't show up very much. So in this case, we've got a seam. You want to start at the end and you want to go through the bottom side of your fabric so that the knot won't show up on the outside. And then for a ladder stitch, you're going to create a stitch that actually looks like a ladder. That's why it's called this. So you go from one side of the seam and then over to the other side and make a stitch on the other side. So you can see there's a length of fabric across the gap. And then you keep going at equal distances across and then over. And they don't have to be perfectly even. Obviously your goal is to make your stitches pretty even, but then you just want to go back and forth across the gap where your seam is, and do it about the same distance on both sides. And that way you'll have building up the steps of the ladder with the floss, and you'll be able to see the kind of threads evenly going across the seam. And as you keep doing this, you'll see that you'll get more and more stitches across, and you can pull it tight as you go, but you can also just leave it open as I have done here, just to make sure that you can kind of see what you're doing and see the evenness of the rungs of the ladder that you're creating. And then when you get to the end, you're going to pull all of the thread through and it'll tighten up all the stitches. And then you can see that it's held together in that seam. And you can see a little bit of the stitches there, but it's mostly an invisible stitch. And this one again was a very flat seam, so it makes a fairly square seam. But you can curve it however you need to match the buddy that you want to do. And then at the very edge there, you want to just pull the thread through a little bit of the fabric. And if you go through that inside fabric a couple of times, that'll create enough of a knot that it will secure the thread so that it won't come loose again. And you can use that same trick of going all the way through the buddy and pulling it through to the back, as you can see, and then just snipping off the end. Make sure it's not pulling anything out of shape, and then you'll be all set. And then you've got your seam, and it's all done. So these are just a few stitches to help you sewing if you want to sew parts of your buddy. Thank you all so much for reading and making with us today. The summer reading program is generously sponsored by the library trustees and the Friends of the Brookline Public Library. Please check out our other videos in this playlist for more tips and tricks in creating your buddy.